Everyone knows the Thompson submachine gun. You've seen it in movies, in museums, in the hands of gangsters and generals alike. That drum magazine, that heavy wooden stock, that unmistakable silhouette, the Chicago typewriter, the trench broom, the gun that practically defined a generation of American firepower. But here's what most people don't know. At some point during the Second World War, American soldiers, specifically the most elite airborne troops the United States had ever trained, were handed something better. And when the army tried to take it away and replace it with the American-made alternative they'd been promised, those same soldiers refused. They complained. They argued. They begged. Some of them found ways to hold on to it even after the official order came down. That weapon wasn't American. It wasn't German. It wasn't even considered cutting edge at the time. It was British. It was stamped out of cheap metal, looked like something you'd build in a high school workshop, and had been publicly dismissed as outdated almost from the moment it entered service. But the men who carried it into combat, the men who jumped out of aircraft in the dark over Sicily and Normandy and the Netherlands, they knew something that the weapons designers and the procurement officers back home had missed entirely. And if you want to understand what they knew, you have to go back to before the war, to a problem that no one in the military establishment really wanted to admit existed. If you haven't already, hit subscribe. This is exactly the kind of story we dig into here. The weapons history forgot to simplify, told the way it actually happened. So let's go back to the beginning. Not to the battlefields, but to the drawing boards. Because the story of why American paratroopers fell in love with a British submachine gun starts with a series of failures, compromises, and institutional blind spots that nearly left some of the most important soldiers of the war armed with weapons that were wrong for the job. Before the Second World War, the United States Army had a complicated relationship with submachine guns. The Thompson had been around since the early 1920s, and while it was undeniably powerful, it was also undeniably expensive. In the late 1930s, a single Thompson cost somewhere in the range of $200. In today's money, that's well over $3,000 per weapon. For a military that was still operating on a peacetime budget and hadn't yet begun the massive industrial mobilization that the war would eventually trigger, that price tag was essentially a deal-breaker for widespread issue. The Thompson was there, it was available, but it wasn't being handed out to every soldier who might benefit from it. It was a specialty item, a luxury almost. And then the war started, and suddenly everything changed. The army needed submachine guns by the hundreds of thousands. The production lines that had been running slowly, carefully, expensively, suddenly needed to shift into overdrive, and almost immediately, the people responsible for feeding an entire army realized that the Thompson, for all its legendary qualities, was a manufacturing nightmare. The thing was machined to an extraordinary degree of precision. It had over 100 individual parts. It required skilled machinists and significant time to produce each unit. That was fine when you were making guns for gangsters and law enforcement agencies. It was not fine when you needed to arm millions of soldiers in the shortest possible time. The army knew this going in, and so even before Pearl Harbor, the decision was already being made to develop a cheaper, simpler, faster-to-produce replacement. The result was the M3 submachine gun, which would eventually earn its own nickname, the grease gun, for the straightforward reason that it looked almost exactly like the tool mechanics used to lubricate machinery. The M3 was designed specifically to be cheap and easy to produce. It was stamped from sheet metal rather than machined from solid steel. It had a relatively simple operating mechanism. It was slow to produce in terms of individual craftsmanship, because almost no individual craftsmanship was involved. It could be churned out fast in enormous quantities. But here's the problem. The M3 wouldn't be ready right away. The design process took time. The tooling of production facilities took time. And in the meantime, the soldiers who needed submachine guns most urgently, the paratroopers who were being trained and deployed as a revolutionary new form of mobile assault infantry, needed something now. And the Thompson, reliable as it was was still the primary option on the American side. Now here's where the British come in. And to understand why the British solution was so remarkable, you have to understand how it came to exist at all. In 1940, Britain was in a state of crisis that makes almost any modern military problem look trivial. After the catastrophe at Dunkirk, the British Army had left an almost unimaginable quantity of equipment on the beaches of France. Hundreds of thousands of rifles, tens of thousands of machine guns, artillery pieces, vehicles, ammunition. Almost the entire heavy equipment inventory of the British Expeditionary Force had been abandoned. The men came home, but the weapons didn't. And now Britain needed to rearm, immediately, from almost nothing, with an industrial base that was being bombed on a nightly basis by the Luftwaffe. The standard British submachine gun at the time was the Thompson. Yes, the same Thompson that the Americans were struggling to afford. Britain had been purchasing them under Lend-Lease arrangements and other procurement deals, but they were expensive, they were dependent on American production capacity, and there simply weren't enough of them. Something had to change. The solution came from two men, Major Reginald Shepherd, an inspector of armaments with the British Army, and Harold Turpin, a designer working at the Royal Small Arms Factory at Enfield. Their brief was almost brutally simple. Design a submachine gun that could be manufactured as quickly and cheaply as possible using the absolute minimum of materials and machining. It had to work reliably under combat conditions. It had to fire the 9mm parabellum cartridge that the British military was standardizing on. It had to be simple enough that production could be dispersed across dozens of small workshops and light manufacturing facilities, not just major armament factories. And it had to be ready fast. What Shepherd and Turpin came up with was the Sten gun, and the name itself tells you something about the weapon's origins. The S came from Shepherd, the T came from Turpin, the EN came from Enfield, Sten, 4 letters that would go on to represent one of the most controversial, most criticized, most beloved, and most effective weapons designs of the entire war. The first Sten, the Mark I, appeared in 1941, and immediately people hated it, not because it didn't work, but because of what it looked like. It had a thin cylindrical barrel with a simple perforated jacket, a wire stock that folded or didn't fold depending on the variant, a magazine that stuck out sideways from the left side of the receiver rather than underneath it, and an overall appearance that suggested something assembled hastily from plumbing supplies rather than precision engineered in a weapons factory, which, to be fair, wasn't entirely inaccurate. The early Sten guns cost approximately $11 each to manufacture. Some sources put it even lower, around $9 for the most streamlined versions. Compare that to the $200 Thompson, and you start to understand why the British military, despite the complaints and the mockery, immediately ordered them in enormous quantities. The criticisms were real, though. The early Sten had reliability problems, particularly with the magazine. The double-stack, single-feed magazine design was genuinely troublesome. Rounds could jam, followers could stick, and if you handled the magazine roughly or got dirt into the feed lips, the whole weapon would stop working. This wasn't a theoretical problem. It happened in the field. It happened in training, and it gave the Sten a reputation for unreliability that it never entirely shed, even after the worst of the problems were addressed in later production runs. There were also early issues with accidental discharges. The simple blowback mechanism meant that a sharp knock to the bolt could sometimes cause the weapon to fire without the trigger being pulled. For soldiers who were carrying their weapons at the ready in close-quarters combat, this was not a minor inconvenience. It was a potentially lethal design flaw. The British Army addressed it in later variants by improving the safety mechanism, but the early reputation stuck. And then there was just the general experience of using it. The Sten was loud, it was imprecise at long range, it had a tendency to climb during automatic fire, and it felt, frankly, cheap. Because it was cheap. There was no getting around that. You couldn't dress it up. When you picked up a Sten gun and compared it to a Thompson, the difference in perceived quality was immediately and viscerally obvious. The Thompson felt like a weapon. The Sten felt like a prototype, or, as British soldiers were fond of saying, a plumber's nightmare. The jokes about the Sten were everywhere. It was called the Stench gun. It was called the Woolworth gun, a reference to the British cheap goods retailer. Soldiers said it was the weapon that could accidentally kill the man carrying it, the man next to him, or the enemy, in that order of likelihood. Some of that was exaggerated, some of it wasn't. But here's the thing. Underneath all that criticism, underneath the jokes and the reputation, and the legitimate early quality control issues, was a weapon that, in the right hands, under the right circumstances, was genuinely excellent. And the circumstances that mattered most were exactly the ones that American paratroopers were about to find themselves in. To understand why the Sten worked so well for paratroopers specifically, you have to understand what paratroopers actually needed from a weapon, and it's quite different from what conventional infantry needed. When you jump out of an aircraft at night over enemy territory, your primary concern is not what happens a week into the campaign. Your primary concern is what happens in the first 30 seconds after you land. If you land in the right place with the right people, fantastic. If you land in the wrong place alone, tangled in a tree, surrounded by confused and hostile enemy soldiers who are now fully awake, your weapon is the only thing standing between you and a very short military career. In that situation, you don't need a weapon that's accurate at 300 meters. You need a weapon that's compact enough to carry during the jump without getting tangled in your parachute or snagged on the aircraft. You need something that can be brought into action instantly, in the dark, with cold hands, possibly while still partially entangled in your parachute lines. You need something that can put a lot of rounds downrange in a short time at close range. And you need something that is absolutely unfailingly reliable when your life depends on it working. Now, the Thompson met some of those requirements. It was reliable, it was powerful. The .45 ACP cartridge it fired had tremendous stopping power. But the Thompson was also heavy, weighing around 10 to 12 pounds fully loaded, depending on the magazine. It was long, awkward to stow during a jump, and it was expensive enough that the Army was already looking to replace it rather than expand its production. The M1 carbine, which the Army was pushing hard as the standard light weapon for paratroopers and other special infantry, was lighter and easier to handle than a full rifle, but it fired a relatively underpowered intermediate cartridge that had its own set of reliability issues, particularly in cold weather, and didn't deliver the concentrated automatic firepower that close-quarters combat demanded. And then there was the M3 grease gun, the intended Thompson replacement. It was simple, it was cheap, it was chambered for port, 45 ACP, but it was also, at least in its early versions, genuinely difficult to control during automatic fire, due to its slow rate of fire, combined with the heavy recoil of the 45 cartridge. And it had its own quality control problems stemming from the rush to get it into production. Soldiers who used it in combat often described it as unreliable and ungainly. Into this complicated situation came the Sten, specifically the Sten Mark II, which was the variant most commonly encountered by American paratroopers through two main channels. First, through their operational cooperation with British Airborne and Special Operations Forces who were already using it. Second, through direct issue to American units operating in theaters where the Sten was the most readily available submachine gun. The Sten Mark II was the most produced and most refined of the Sten variants, representing a further simplification from the already simple Mark I. It was lighter than the Thompson, coming in at just over 7 pounds unloaded. It was shorter, thanks to that folding or removable stock. And critically for paratroopers, it could be partially disassembled extremely quickly. The barrel could be removed in seconds. The stock could be folded or detached. The whole weapon could be broken down into components that were easier to pack during a jump and reassembled quickly on landing. That feature alone was worth a great deal to men who had to think very carefully about every cubic inch of space available to them during an airborne operation. The Sten also fired 9mm parabellum. That might seem like an odd advantage, but in the context where American paratroopers were operating, it was actually enormously valuable. In Sicily, in Italy, in France, in the Netherlands, the enemy soldiers all around them were using weapons chambered for 9mm. German submachine guns, German pistols, Italian weapons, all running on 9mm. If your Sten ran dry and you needed ammunition in a hurry, you could take it from a dead or captured enemy soldier. You could not do that with a Thompson. The Tomp 45 ACP cartridge was exclusively American. In enemy territory, if you ran out of 45, you were out. If you ran out of 9mm, you started looking around. This kind of logistical flexibility, the ability to sustain yourself on captured enemy ammunition, was not something the Army's procurement officers had thought about very carefully. But the paratroopers who were actually doing the fighting thought about it a great deal, and the Sten's caliber compatibility with enemy weapons made it look a lot more attractive once you were behind enemy lines. Then there was the rate of fire. The Sten fired at roughly 500 rounds per minute in full automatic mode. That's not exceptionally fast by submachine gun standards, but it was controllable. The cyclic rate was slow enough that a skilled shooter could fire single shots with trigger discipline, while still having the option of full auto when the situation called for it. The Thompson fired faster, around 700 rounds per minute, which sounds better until you're trying to control it in a dark hedgerow with one hand while you fight to get your bearings. The lighter cartridge also meant less recoil per shot, which combined with that moderate cyclic rate made the Sten genuinely manageable during automatic fire. For close quarters combat in buildings, in trenches, in the kind of chaotic close-range fighting that airborne operations so often produced, that controllability was critically important. So the Sten was lighter, more compact, compatible with enemy ammunition, easily field-stripped for storage during jumps, and sufficiently controllable in the close-range automatic fire situations that paratroopers most often faced. Those were serious advantages, serious enough that the soldiers carrying them noticed, serious enough that when the order came down to give them up, there was real resistance. Now let's talk about where this actually happened, because the story of American paratroopers and the Sten isn't a single event. It played out across multiple operations, multiple theaters, and multiple points of contact between American and British forces. The first major instance where American airborne troops encountered the Sten in serious numbers was during the preparations for and execution of Operation Husky, the Allied invasion of Sicily in July of 1943. This was the first large-scale Allied airborne operation of the war, and it was a disaster in almost every possible operational sense, though not because of the weapons. The paratroopers were scattered by wind, navigation errors, and friendly fire incidents that are still among the most tragic episodes of the Allied campaign. But in the chaos that followed, the American paratroopers who found themselves operating alongside British forces quickly got their hands on Sten guns and began using them alongside their own weapons. The 82nd Airborne Division, which bore the brunt of the American airborne commitment in Sicily, was operating in close proximity to British airborne forces who were almost universally armed with Stens. In the confused fighting that followed the scattered drops, weapons were shared, borrowed, and traded on an improvised basis, and the Americans who picked up the Sten discovered something that their initial impression of the weapon hadn't prepared them for. The thing worked. Not perfectly, the magazine issues were real, but the fundamental operating mechanism, the stamped metal receiver, the simple bolt, the straightforward firing cycle, all of that was reliable under the conditions they were experiencing. Sand, dirt, seawater, the physical abuse of a hard landing, none of it stopped the Sten from functioning. The Thompson was reliable too, nobody was questioning that. But the Sten's combination of lighter weight, easier stowage, and ammunition compatibility with the weapons they were capturing from Italian and German soldiers made it genuinely compelling, and the men carrying it into combat responded accordingly. By the time the Italian campaign was deepening and the planning for the eventual invasion of northwestern Europe was underway, the Sten had developed a strong reputation among the American paratroopers who had encountered it. Not a reputation for elegance or prestige, the jokes about it never really stopped, but a reputation for doing the job it needed to do in the environments where they needed it done. The most significant chapter in this story came in the lead-up to Operation Overlord, the Normandy invasion of June 1944, and specifically in the context of the American airborne forces that would spearhead that operation. The 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions, both of which would jump into Normandy in the early hours of D-Day, were equipped primarily with American weapons: M1 Garand for the regular infantry, M1 carbines for the paratroopers who needed lighter weapons, Thompsons for those who needed submachine guns. But the supply chain situation and the operational relationships between American and British forces meant that Sten guns were available, were being used, and were in some cases actively preferred. And this is where the documented resistance to giving them up becomes most vivid. Accounts from veterans of the 101st and 82nd Airborne consistently describe soldiers who had acquired Sten guns through trade, borrowing, or battlefield pickup fighting to keep them rather than exchange them for the M1 carbine or the newer M3 grease gun. The M3 was supposed to be the Thompson's replacement, and officially it was being phased in. But soldiers who had used the Sten in combat found the M3's slow rate of fire, heavy recoil, and early quality control problems less appealing than the weapon they'd already learned to trust. One of the most frequently cited aspects of this resistance involves the jump configuration. American paratroopers were extraordinarily careful about how they packed their equipment for a jump. Every ounce and every inch mattered. The Sten, particularly with its stock removed or folded, could be packed in a leg bag or tucked against the body in ways that the Thompson and the M1 carbine, with their longer barrels and fixed stocks, could not. The ability to jump with your submachine gun already loaded and ready, in a compact package, and then quickly reassemble it on the ground, was the kind of advantage that the Army's weapons evaluators hadn't thought through, but that the men actually doing the jumping appreciated enormously. There's also a psychological element worth considering. These were men who had been through combat. They had used these weapons, they knew which ones had kept them alive and which ones had given them trouble at critical moments. When you've been in a firefight in a Sicilian farmyard at 2 a.m, and the Sten worked when you needed it to, you develop a relationship with that weapon that no amount of official doctrine or replacement scheduling can easily override. These weren't soldiers who were resisting change out of stubbornness or ignorance. They were resisting it because their lives depended on their equipment, and they knew from experience what worked. The Army's official position was somewhat contradictory. On one hand, there was clear institutional preference for standardization. Having every soldier in a unit running on the same weapon, the same caliber, the same spare parts, was the logistician's dream. From a purely supply chain perspective, having American paratroopers running 9mm British submachine guns in the middle of an American logistics system was a headache nobody wanted. On the other hand, the Army also had a strong tradition of combat effectiveness pragmatism. If a weapon worked, the men in the field found ways to keep using it regardless of what the official tables of organization and equipment said. The result was a kind of informal compromise. At the official level, the Sten was not the standard weapon for American paratroopers. At the practical level, plenty of American paratroopers went into combat in Normandy, carrying or at least bringing along Sten guns they had acquired through various unofficial channels. The 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment, which would later be immortalized as part of the story of Easy Company and Band of Brothers, has documented connections to this phenomenon. Veterans of the unit described the mix of weapons carried on the Normandy jump as reflecting practical experience rather than official doctrine. The men carried what they believed would keep them alive, and for a significant number of them, that included a British submachine gun that cost less to build than a decent pair of shoes. The jump into Normandy on the night of June 5th and 6th, 1944, was even more scattered than the Sicily operation had been. The American paratroopers were dropped over an enormous area, many of them far from their intended drop zones. Small groups, sometimes individuals, found themselves fighting their way across the Norman countryside in the dark, trying to find their units, trying to accomplish their objectives, trying to survive until daylight. In those conditions, the qualities that made the Sten attractive to paratroopers became even more immediately relevant. Compact enough to carry through hedgerows, compatible with captured German ammunition, reliable enough to function after a rough landing in a rain-soaked field. It did its job. For Operation Market Garden in September of 1944, the massive airborne operation in the Netherlands that aimed to seize a series of bridges deep into German-held territory, the Sten's presence among American airborne troops was even more pronounced. By this point, the operational relationship between American and British airborne forces was well established. The 82nd and 101st Airborne were operating in direct coordination with the British 1st Airborne Division, which was jumping at Arnhem. The proximity of British forces meant ready access to British equipment and ammunition, and the Sten continued to circulate among American soldiers who had decided that its practical advantages outweighed its official status as a foreign weapon they weren't supposed to be using. The fighting around Nijmegen and Eindhoven during Market Garden was often exactly the kind of close-quarters urban combat that the Sten was best suited for. Buildings, narrow streets, ambushes at short range. In those environments, the high-volume, close-range firepower of a submachine gun was far more valuable than the accuracy of a rifle, and the Sten's moderate recoil and controllable cyclic rate made it effective in exactly those conditions. By the time the war moved into its final phases, the story of American paratroopers and the Sten had become somewhat institutionalized in the informal culture of the airborne community. The weapon had a reputation, not a glamorous one. The jokes about it were never going to stop entirely, but a reliable one, in the sense that matters most to soldiers. It had been tested under fire. It had been found wanting in some respects and excellent in others, and the men who had carried it had made their own judgment about which column outweighed the other. But here's something fascinating that gets very little attention in the standard histories. The story of the Sten doesn't exist in isolation from the broader question of what American paratroopers thought about the weapons they were being issued. And to really understand the full picture, you have to look at the specific complaints that were lodged about the M1 carbine, which was the weapon the Army considered the primary light arm for paratroopers throughout much of the war. The M1 carbine was, in many respects, a genuinely impressive piece of engineering. It weighed about 5.5 pounds, significantly lighter than the Garand. It was relatively compact. It fired a semi-automatic action, which meant a much higher practical rate of fire than a bolt-action rifle. It was designed specifically for rear-echelon troops, vehicle crews, and others who needed a weapon lighter than the standard infantry rifle. And it was subsequently extended to paratroopers, who also needed lightness and compactness. But the M1 carbine had serious problems in combat that became more apparent the more intensively it was used. The .30 carbine cartridge it fired was an intermediate round that occupied an awkward middle ground between pistol and rifle performance. It was considerably less powerful than the .30-06 round fired by the Garand, and even at the ranges where it was most likely to be used, its terminal performance was genuinely disappointing. Soldiers reported repeatedly that the .30 carbine round lacked stopping power. You could hit a man with it, even multiple times, and he might keep coming if he was running on adrenaline or physical determination. That wasn't a problem you could afford in the middle of a night firefight. The M1 carbine also had reliability problems in cold weather that were serious enough to generate official complaints and post-operation reports. During the Battle of the Bulge in the winter of 1944 to 1945, when temperatures dropped to extraordinary lows in the Ardennes, the M1 carbine's operating mechanism was frequently found to be sluggish or non-functional. The lubricants that kept it working thickened in the cold. The gas-operated action that made it semi-automatic was sensitive to fouling and temperature in ways that the simpler blowback mechanisms of submachine guns simply weren't. Soldiers in the worst winter conditions of the European War found their M1 carbines freezing up on them at the moments when they needed them most. The Sten, with its simple blowback action, had no such problems. A blowback submachine gun operates on the most basic mechanical principle possible. The bolt is driven backward by the pressure of the fired cartridge, ejects the spent case, compresses the recoil spring, and then the spring drives the bolt forward again, stripping a fresh round from the magazine and chambering it. There are no gas ports to foul, no pistons to freeze, no complex timing mechanisms to fail in the cold. As long as the ammunition fed reliably and the bolt cycled freely, the Sten worked. And in the cold, that simplicity was an enormous advantage. The combination of the M1 carbine's cold weather unreliability and its insufficient stopping power meant that paratroopers who had already been skeptical of it before the Battle of the Bulge became actively hostile to it afterward, and the comparison to the Sten became even more pointed. Here was a weapon that had been derided as cheap, primitive, and outdated, and in the worst conditions the European theater could produce, it outperformed the precision-engineered American alternative. That paradox, that a weapon designed to be cheap and simple could outperform one designed to be precise and sophisticated, gets to the heart of something important about weapons design philosophy that military planners were still working through during the Second World War and have never really stopped debating since. The basic principle is this: in combat, a weapon doesn't need to be perfect. It needs to be reliable, functional, and suited to the specific demands of the environment in which it's being used. A masterwork of precision engineering that fails in the mud or the cold is less valuable than a simple stamped metal tube that keeps working no matter what you do to it. The Sten was never going to win a beauty contest. It was never going to impress anyone who compared it to the Thompson or the German MP40. But it would work in a Normandy hedgerow at 3 in the morning after you'd landed in the wrong field and dragged it through a drainage ditch. And for the men who needed it in those circumstances, that was the only evaluation that mattered. It's worth pausing here to talk about the MP40, because the comparison between the Sten and its German counterpart is instructive in ways that tell you a great deal about the different design philosophies at work on either side of the war. The MP40 was Germany's primary submachine gun from 1940 onward. It was, by virtually any technical measure, a superior weapon to the Sten. It had a folding stock that was more robust and more comfortable than the Sten's wire arrangement. Its mechanism was more refined. Its feed reliability was better. Its overall construction quality was higher. German soldiers and Allied soldiers who captured and used MP40s consistently praised them as excellent weapons. But the MP40 cost significantly more to produce than the Sten. The Germans were never able to manufacture them in the quantities they needed, which is why German infantry units so often relied on bolt-action rifles for the bulk of their firepower, rather than the submachine guns that would have been more useful in close combat. The manufacturing bottleneck was a genuine strategic problem. The British had made a different choice. They had sacrificed quality for quantity, and they had done so consciously and deliberately because they understood that in a total war being fought across multiple continents simultaneously, the side that could put the most functional weapons in the most soldiers' hands would have a structural advantage that no amount of individual weapon superiority could overcome. The Sten was proof of that logic. It wasn't the best submachine gun of the war, but it was everywhere, in enormous numbers, in the hands of soldiers who had learned to use it and trusted it. And that ubiquity had its own strategic value. The American paratroopers who chose the Sten over the M1 carbine or the early M3 grease gun were intuitively grasping this same logic. They weren't choosing it because it was the best weapon in absolute terms. They were choosing it because it was the best weapon for their specific situation, which included the need for compactness, the logistical advantage of 9mm compatibility, and the reliability of a simple mechanism in challenging field conditions. The Sten's relationship with Allied Special Operations Forces deserves its own consideration as well, because it provides additional context for why the weapon was so highly regarded in unconventional warfare settings that mirrored the conditions paratroopers faced. The Special Operations Executive, Britain's sabotage and resistance organization that operated across occupied Europe, used the Sten as one of its primary weapons for arming resistance fighters and conducting operations behind enemy lines. The Sten was ideal for this purpose for reasons that overlapped significantly with why paratroopers valued it. It was compact enough to conceal under a coat. It could be broken down and carried in pieces. It was cheap enough to produce and parachute drop in massive quantities to resistance groups that had no other access to modern weapons. And it was simple enough to use and maintain that people with minimal weapons training could operate it effectively. The Office of Strategic Services, the American equivalent of the SOE that would eventually become the CIA, also used Sten guns extensively in their operations. American OSS agents operating in France, Italy, Yugoslavia, and throughout the resistance networks of occupied Europe were routinely equipped with Sten guns rather than American weapons, partly for ammunition compatibility reasons, and partly because the Sten was simply available and well suited to clandestine work. This means that the Sten wasn't just a weapon that regular American paratroopers encountered and adopted informally. It was also the weapon of choice for the most specialized, most highly trained, most operationally demanding American military personnel of the entire war. When the best soldiers the United States had, the ones being sent on the most sensitive and dangerous missions, chose the Sten, that said something significant about its practical value. There's also the matter of the silent Sten, which represents one of the most fascinating specific applications of the design. The Sten Mark I IS was a specially modified variant fitted with an integral suppressor, designed specifically for silent killing operations. It was used by commandos and special operations personnel, and it was genuinely effective. The simple blowback mechanism, combined with a relatively easy-to-suppress 9mm cartridge operating at subsonic velocities, made the Sten an excellent candidate for suppression in ways that the Thompson, with its heavier .45 cartridge, was not. American OSS personnel operating in occupied Europe used silent Sten guns for the same covert purposes as their British counterparts. The existence of the suppressed Sten variant is a good indicator of how far the design had come from its origins as a rushed emergency solution. When you're modifying a weapon for specialized covert operations use, when you're trusting it to function silently in situations where a malfunction could mean immediate death, you're not doing that with a weapon you fundamentally don't trust. The development and widespread use of the Sten loose is evidence that, beneath the jokes and the criticism, serious military planners had made a genuine assessment of the Sten's reliability and found it worth building on. Let's also address the elephant in the room that any honest history of the Sten has to confront, which is the genuine accidents and failures that the weapon was responsible for. The Sten did cause accidents. The early safety mechanism was inadequate, and there were documented cases of the weapon firing when dropped or struck without the trigger being pulled. These were not manufacturing defects in the usual sense, but design problems, fundamental issues with the way the safety interacted with the bolt that took several iterations to address properly. British soldiers who trained with early Sten guns were taught to carry them with the bolt in specific positions to minimize the risk. The magazine loading procedure was important not just for reliability but for safety. Veterans of the war who used Sten guns frequently had strong opinions about the correct and incorrect ways to handle them, opinions based on the hard lessons of watching weapons discharge unexpectedly. These were real problems that took real lives, and any balanced account of the Sten has to acknowledge them. But it's important to put those problems in context. The Garand, the M1 carbine, the Thompson, the M3 grease gun, all of them had their own safety and reliability issues. The Thompson's drum magazines were notoriously prone to jamming. The M1 carbine's gas mechanism was sensitive to cold and fouling. The M3's early production quality was poor enough that field complaints were common and widespread. No weapon of the war was perfect. The Sten's problems were real, but they were not categorically worse than the problems of its competitors, and in many cases they were significantly better. The later Sten variants, particularly the Mark III and the Mark V, addressed many of the worst of the early issues. The Mark V, which appeared in 1944, was perhaps the most refined version, featuring a better pistol grip, an improved stock, and the ability to accept the bayonet from the Lee-Enfield rifle. It retained all of the Sten's fundamental advantages while addressing some of its worst ergonomic shortcomings. American soldiers who encountered the Mark V specifically often described it in somewhat more favorable terms than the earlier variants, though the basic design remained recognizable throughout. Now let's zoom out and think about what this story tells us about the broader lessons of weapons development and military doctrine, because the Sten's unexpected popularity among elite American troops illuminates some principles that remain relevant to this day. The first principle is the tyranny of the spec sheet. Military weapons procurement has always had a tendency to evaluate weapons in controlled conditions against predetermined criteria that may not accurately reflect combat reality. The Sten, evaluated on a test range by procurement officers focused on precision, finish quality, and manufacturing standards, looked terrible compared to the Thompson or the MP40 or virtually anything else available. Evaluated in a Normandy hedgerow at 3 in the morning by a paratrooper who had just landed in the wrong field and needed something that would work right now, it looked considerably better. The soldiers who chose to keep their Sten guns were applying the only weapons evaluation criteria that ultimately matters, which is whether the thing works when you need it to, in the conditions you actually face, rather than the conditions that are easiest to standardize and measure. Military procurement has improved dramatically since the Second World War, but the tension between laboratory performance and field performance has never entirely disappeared. The second principle is the value of simplicity under stress. This is related to the first, but distinct. The Sten simplicity, which procurement officers and design purists criticized as crude, was actually one of its greatest practical virtues. A weapon with fewer parts, simpler operation, and less precision-dependent mechanisms is a weapon that is more likely to function correctly when it's being operated by a cold, exhausted, frightened soldier in the dark. Complexity is the enemy of reliability under adverse conditions. The Sten's designers understood this intuitively, even if they were driven to simplicity primarily by production constraints rather than philosophical commitment to it. The third principle is the importance of ammunition logistics in unconventional warfare. The Sten's compatibility with German and Italian 9mm ammunition wasn't a deliberate design choice in the sense of being planned for that purpose. It was a consequence of the British military's standardization decision regarding the 9mm cartridge. But the practical value of that compatibility for paratroopers and special operations personnel operating behind enemy lines was enormous. The ability to sustain yourself on captured enemy ammunition is a strategic capability that doesn't show up on any spec sheet, but that can be the difference between mission success and mission failure when you're cut off from your own supply lines. The fourth principle is the relationship between soldiers and their weapons. This is perhaps the most human element of the story. The American paratroopers who fought to keep their Sten guns weren't just making a technical judgment about weapon performance. They were expressing something about the nature of the relationship between a soldier and the tool he depends on for his life. When you've carried a weapon through combat, when you've trusted it and it's delivered, you develop a connection to it that transcends rational analysis. The Sten might have looked cheap and felt rough compared to the Thompson, but it had kept men alive, and that fact accumulated into a kind of institutional knowledge that moved through the airborne community faster and more reliably than any official procurement directive. The story of the Sten gun among American paratroopers is also a story about the fluid, pragmatic, improvised